Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. I apologize for missing last week. It was a little busy, and then the news started piling up to the point where I just wanted to wait for a clean 2 weeks in order to put out a new episode. I am doing this episode solo again. Unfortunately, GSP is still not able to join us because of his ongoing situation. However, I will let you know, as always, and even on these episodes he has not been on, he has been instrumental in behind the scenes work, helping me put these shows together. It's just a matter of circumstance. He cannot be on the program, front facing, giving his opinions along with me during the recording sessions. But I still want you guys to know that in due time he will return, and also that he is still playing a pivotal role in helping me organize the show. And I would not be able to put on this program if it was not for his assistance, and that we are in frequent daily contact. About this, about news events, and just in general. So, giving a brief update on the front line in Ukraine, I'll start in the Sumy direction, where we have Russian advances in Tetkino, which you can see on the furthest left end of this map right here, them advancing out from Tetkino. You also have Russian advances in Kondratovka, which you can see if you look on the center right of the map, just the single Russian arrow right there. That's where the Russians are advancing. And once again, this is in the Sumy direction. This is towards the border between Sumy and Kursk Oblasts, where the Russians are pushing in for their so-called buffer zone after the repulsion of the Kursk offensive. In terms of ongoing fighting, there are reportedly 8 Ukrainian counterattacks on this front right now, and you can see those where the two arrows meet. Those are particularly in Beselovka, Alexievka, Yunakovka, and Sadki right here. And you can see that going left to right, those settlements along the front lines. Moving on to the Volchansk front, it has been relatively quiet compared to the other sectors of the front. However, the Ukrainians are trying to make a counterattack in the Volchansk area right across the border with Russia in the Kharkov Oblast. And this has been an area that has seen pitched fighting, has gone back and forth, and that you do have, of course, a significant amount of forces in this sector, but it's a priority for neither side at this point. But if we are to take Syrski at his word, which I caution you to take that with a grain of salt, he is announcing that the new Ukrainian strategy is to reassert themselves in Kursk and even Belgorod, to continue with the incursions into Russia proper in order to tie up Russian forces, which we've seen attempts to have Russian forces tied down in a second Kursk offensive, which ended in a complete humiliation for the Ukrainians just a few months ago. Almost immediately after the first Kursk offensive resulted in a Ukrainian defeat, in that offensive at least. And moving on to Kupiansk, just to give you a brief overview of the front line. This is the general situation here. I have Kupiansk circled. You can see where the Russians have advanced from Kalinove, and they are jutting out from that sector. And there are reports that they're within miles of Kupiansk at this point. And this is going to be a gradual crawl, as most of the front line has been at this point. And I think we can expect the so-called summer offensive that is going on right now, because it is going on slowly but surely, not to be a big air offensive. I think we are past those days, simply because of ISR and how advanced intelligence sharing is. Neither side can really build up the forces to constitute the so-called big aero offensive, but the Russians will keep chipping away at the front lines. And also in terms of war of attrition, the more they can exhaust Ukrainian and by extension Western resources, as far as the Russians are concerned, that is a completely acceptable outcome. And it also has, as we've seen before, likely staved off possible further involvement from the West with this gradual crawl. And it has been, well, I'm not downplaying the number of Russian casualties because there has been many. It has reduced Russian casualties, especially compared to that of the Ukrainians, where they have been able to play their lives and their manpower much more conservatively. even to the chagrin of some people who you might even say support Russia when you hear voices inside of Russia and even outside of Russia, especially, who pretty much call for the flattening of every city west of the Dnieper. And I mean, I can't speak the situation when it comes to the Russians in Russia in particular, but as it continues now, this war is going to be a gradual crawl. We're 3.5 years into this, just about, and I don't think much is going to change in that. But even then, the Ukrainians are still on the back foot, and sure you can look at the maps day after day, month after month, even from the years, and it might not look very impressive. But this is the nature of this war. I've said it many times before. I will say it again. It is fought village by village. It is something that they will continue to do, especially when it comes to the Donbass front, especially when it comes to the Donbass, very heavily industrialized area. And once the Pokrovsk front is solved, we will have a much clearer picture of what this war is going to look like, and we'll have possibly the fabled drive to the Dnieper, or the long-awaited drive to the Dnieper, if you will. But moving on to an overview of Chasiv Yar. This is the front of Chasiv Yar, and at this point, the majority of the city is under Russian control. It's just a few outlying districts where the Ukrainians still have a foothold, and you can expect them at this point to be moving towards Konstantinovka on the Chasiv Yar front. And it is reported by some local sources that Stubochki and Prechetino, which are on the way to Konstantinovka, you can see them circled right here, are now part of the gray zone, and that fighting will continue there, and that will become the next active part of that front now that Chasiv Yar is effectively a resolved battle. And I'll give you just another overview of the front where those two settlements are, the Stubochki and the Prechetino, in comparison to Konstantinovka. So that is what you can see in the front line. And then if you switch back, that is Chasiv Yar right there. You can see in the very distance the where it says VKA or VKA, where Konstantinovka is on the map. Moving on to the Pokrovsk front, the Pokrovsk-Leningrad front. This is the overall situation right here, and I'll give you a more detailed overlook of some of the actions by the Russian forces. So, on this part of the map right now, you have the Russians advancing towards Novotoretskoye, which is the furthest up one on the map with the red arrow, with ongoing fighting near Boykovka and Fedorovka right here on the map as well. Moving on to the other part of the front, you have the Russian offensive in, or the Russian advance, I should say, more appropriately, in Yablunovka with a Ukrainian counterattack, with them actually taking some ground in Alexandrovno Kalinovo. And that is a general overview of the front line, with other general reports in the southern front along the Dnieper River on the Kursk, I'm sorry, the Kherson part of the front. It's just an exchange of artillery fire over the river. Neither side has either launched an offensive, so that right now it's been one of the quieter fronts during this war, and it continues to be a quieter front. And it will be, neither side really wants to invest that much, especially if the Russians fell back across the river back in November 2022. We probably, unless it is the so-called end game of the war, will not see much activity out of that sector beyond what is going on right now. But there were some overall stories, I think, that were worth addressing with Ukraine as well, and I'll get into the back and forth with Trump and more of the diplomatic situation surrounding Ukraine. But one story I saw that particularly interested me, that could be a one-off, could be a sign of worse things to come, and this is actually regarding the Russian side. And that is a group of pro-Ukrainian Tatar insurgents sabotaged railways in Volgograd in Russia and also in Crimea as well. They go by the Atesh movement, which is a pro-Ukraine Crimean Tatar partisan organization. They've claimed responsibility for the railway sabotages in Volgograd and Ororove in Crimea. Uh, they did have the footage which showed the destroyed railway relay panel on the 10th of July 2025. The statement that they issued was, and this was via Telegram, so take it with a hefty helping of salt. Agents of the Atesh movement carried out a successful sabotage on a strategically important railway junction in Volgograd, a relay cabinet that provided communication. And given the position of the Crimean Tatars, many have pro-Ukrainian sympathies, at least uh, in this time and place in history, where they align themselves with the Ukrainian state. Of course, they see many more of the nationalistic ones see Crimea as theirs proper. They want to see the Khanate, I suppose, reestablished in some form. And while the Tatars in Russia have generally gone along with the rest of civil society in at least supporting this war in one way or another, you do have elements of the Tatars, especially the ones from Ukraine, who are very adamantly pro-Ukraine, which I think puts some of the narratives about the Russians are using the Buryats or the other Siberian tribes. They're bringing down the East Asian armies upon Europe once again, when at the same time the Ukrainians do the exact same thing as they have the Colombian mercenaries. And it's a ridiculous argument that is targeted at Western right wingers, that we're supposed to sit here and shake our fist at Russia as our own societies go to hell because the Russians recruit from their Asian populations, and the Ukrainians would never dare field a non-European, non-blonde hair, blue-eyed individual in their army. Just ignore that Zelensky was sitting down with breakfast with in particular Muslim soldiers of the AFU just a few months ago. That didn't happen. He doesn't have a Tatar defense minister. That's not the case at all. He himself is not part of a certain ethno-religious group commonly found in the Middle East, and also has a large diaspora. Neither is a significant amount of his cabinet. Just ignore that. But I'm getting a little derailed, no pun intended, with that one. But what I will say about this group in particular is that many Tatar groups that were dissidents during the Soviet Union, which where a lot of the groups have their origins, have received support and even paramilitary training from the Turkish state. And given Turkey's role in this war and their interest in its outcomes, which I would say they are more than happy, of course, to play NATO and Russia against each other. If we're to believe the neo-Ottoman ideology and take it more seriously than just bluster, which I think, given what we saw in Syria in these past few months, as well as other parts of the Middle East and even situations involving Europe and the Balkans, that there is some degree of credibility to what Erdogan and even a lot of other Turkish officials say to this whole neo-Ottoman ideology. So the fact that they would want to align themselves with Crimean Tatars or Tatar organizations and have them act as proxies in that region, in the northern Black Sea, is not out of the realm of possibility whatsoever. And I doubt that Turkey is really investing everything they have into these groups, but we could see a situation as stability deteriorates and the relationship between Russia and Turkey deteriorates, that these groups start to play a more prominent role. I won't say that they're going to get, say, like the Chechen or the Ичкериans of the 1990s, but these situations can rapidly take a turn for the worse. And we also do have escalating situations in the Caucasus as well, which I'll get into in just a bit here. But I just did want to give a more overall view of the situation in Ukraine. And looking at the month of June alone, there was about 500 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory taken by the Russians, and just within June. as well as calculating the last 3 months as a whole, 1,400 square kilometers, which exceed both matches and then goes on to exceed the scale of Russian advances in the fall of 2024. And the Russians are now making successful offensives towards the bordering villages in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and even managing to take some of them. Syrskyi, despite his claims of victory, does appear disoriented. And now I'm going to quote from the Ukrainian Telegram channel Resident, which, regardless of your view on this war, I think gives pretty good insight, at least to the Ukrainian perspective, of a lot of things going on. But to quote from the Ukrainian Telegram channel Resident, and for good reason, the southwest of the Donetsk region has become the shock zone for the Ukrainian armed forces. Last summer, it had been the best fortifications and well-prepared brigades. Today, even they are collapsing. If part of the front is facing collapse, imagine what waits in Dnipropetrovsk, where fortifications are weaker and in some places non-existent. And with the general staff pulling reserves to Sumy, the defense forces have far less support. Now, the official Ukrainian narrative going on right now, if you listen to any of the talking heads in Kiev, it is front stabilization. We're stabilizing the front in Sumy. We're stabilizing the front in the Donbass. Blah, 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 blah. But as it stands right now, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible here. I apologize if this comes off as too biased, or if there's any sort of bias that I'm overlooking on my part. But as time goes on, the Ukrainian defenses continue to thin out. They are not in a position where they're pulling back in establishing the defenses, maybe even further to the west, as quoted by Syrskyi, according to Resident, which I'll take their word for it in this case. Dnipropetrovsk is functionally undefended, and it has been, as always. Pokrovsk is that last real fortress city, as well as a railway hub, on that Donbass front that dates back to 2014. Which, if that falls within, just say, the next few weeks, because that's coming close, I know the Russians have been very gradual about it. They've been inching at this since last summer towards this. But if there is some sort of coup de grace against Pokrovsk, we could conceivably see a situation where Slovyansk and Kramatorsk are operationally encircled by the end of the year. Now, that's on the most optimistic timeline. I don't want to sensationalize too much. I don't want to talk this situation up too much. But once Pokrovsk falls, no matter on what timeline that is, Slovyansk and Kramatorsk are not long for this world, at least in terms of Ukrainian control. And that the big crown jewels of the Donbass that have been the site of everyone's attention who's followed this war since 2014 may finally be decided. And beyond just the strategic implications, the symbolic implications, that if those fall, with everything else that's happened to Ukraine, when you compound that, you could be looking at a severe morale crisis. And that's also on top of whatever might await in Dnipropetrovsk, or the so-called drive to the Dnieper River, as the last of the defenses from 2014 do start to fall. We could see increased activity on the Kherson front, but it looks like right now the Ukrainians are staking their claim with Sumy, and that they're going to halt the Russians in Sumy, and that will be the sector in which they push back. And if you take Syrskyi at his word yet again, Kursk and Belgorod, he wants to push into there and take the fight back to the Russians. Foolishly, in my opinion. At this point, I think it's a lost cause, at least as far as that's concerned. But that seems to be the main Ukrainian defensive strategy right now. Even as the Donbass starts to slip away, they are going to pour more and more force in the Sumy. And we could see a situation, I'm not saying definitively, but we could see a situation in which Sumy is a repeat of the Kursk offensive, where the Ukrainians feed more and more of their most competent units into the meat grinder to ultimately stop nothing. And we're not seeing a front stabilization. We are seeing the exact opposite. There would have to be some radical changes within the AFU strategy right now if we were to see anything approximating a front stabilization, which I would say starting with building some defenses more in the rear and starting to anticipate the downfall of places like Pokrovsk and the possibility of Slovyansk and Kramatorsk falling, if not the end of this year, within say the next 12 months or so, just to give a rough timeline. I'm not staking my claim on it definitively, but just to give you an idea, by July 2026, and that also brings up the question: how much of a functional Ukrainian army will be left? And a lot of that will have to do with Western aid, which I'll get into the situation with Donald Trump and his little song and dance with all this, because it's been what you'd expect from him. But looking at the situation overall, once again, there's been a number of drone attacks and missile attacks targeted towards Ukraine. So, for starters, this is a map showing the attacks that happened over the night of the 6th of July, last weekend. And they were primarily focused on Kiev, as you can see, with also some targets being hit more out west. But there were much larger scale attacks this past week on the night of the 12th of July, right here, and you can see the targets being hit in Kiev, Lutsk, Lvov, Ternopil, and just across western Ukraine. And to give a brief list of some of the areas that were hit in these recent strikes, it does seem to be an attack on military infrastructure and industrial capacity. Just to give a brief list, in Kirohrad, the Kanatove airfield was attacked. In Lvov, the aircraft repair plant was attacked. And this includes areas that have been invested in heavily by the Western powers in order to supply this war, and that they were manufacturing repair and replacement parts for Western aircraft that were supplied particularly through Poland and once upon a time through Slovakia before the Fico administration got involved. There was also damage in the Lvov region of the factory of Elektronmash, and they produce vehicle parts for armored fighting vehicles and MRAPs as well. And they also hit the Electron plant, which served a similar role as well. In Lutsk, they hit the motor repair plant. I think that's pretty self-explanatory. In Kharkov, that's another area that was hit. You can see right there. There were strikes on workshops and auxiliary buildings, particularly when it came to navigation systems, is what they were particularly targeting. In Chernovsky, which is this part of southwestern Ukraine, right here you can see they were hitting towards the airport area, which is a supply hub in which supplies are brought in from NATO, particularly from Romania, into this airport in southwestern Ukraine, and moved out to the rest of the front line. But as you can see, a number of drone and missile attacks over the night, and you can see which ones are the drone attacks with the yellow triangles and the missile attacks with the red arrows right there. And it has been pretty relentless within, I would say, the past 6 weeks or so, if not longer, when it comes to these waves of Russian attacks where they enjoy almost uncontested air superiority. And even with what air defense they have, and I know the big debate is with the Patriot missile systems right now, which, like I said, we'll get into the Trump stuff in just a minute here. As it stands out, the Russians act with more or less impunity, and they can do this on a weekly basis. It used to be, it was about once every month or so when they would launch these large strikes against military and industrial targets and infrastructure targets in Ukraine. But to move on to Budanov's assessment of the situation in general, he has confirmed on a television interview that parts of Ukrainian lands will have been irretrievably lost, and he had admitted this and that the situation would only get worse. However, he's talking out of both sides of his mouth here Because according to Bloomberg, if you are so inclined to believe them, he believes a ceasefire with Russia is possible by the end of the year. I don't know. Maybe he's stroking Trump's ego. Maybe he wants to be the guy who is poised to replace Zelensky. People have speculated that Budanov has had aspirations for political office for quite some time, and some are even suspecting that now that you have Umarov, the defense secretary, who was serving a role of envoy to the U.S. being, well, I'm sorry, Umarov, who is defense secretary, who is being floated for a replacement for envoy to the U.S. and actually even taking the role of the ambassador. Some are speculating with the shuffle that Budanov might be sidelined. However, there have been significant Western efforts to bail him out and keep him in his position. And some might speculate, and I don't want to go this far because I think the situation is too uncertain. I'll get into the scandal with Yermak and just some of the palace politics in Kiev in just a moment here. But some speculate that Budanov is becoming Washington's favorite man in Kiev, similar to how Zaluzhny was, and in some cases still is, London's favorite man in Kiev, where he is their guy there. And as it stands now, Zelensky is the guy of Brussels and the European Union as a whole. But according to Budanov, to get into his statement, it is realistic to do this. Yes, difficult. Is it difficult? No. And he says it requires the cooperation of Ukraine, Russia, and the United States, and saying that the Russian had tasked the army with advancing 10 kilometers in Dnipropetrovsk to create a buffer zone. At the same time, in his opinion, Russia will not be able to completely capture Donetsk region by the end of the year. The head of Ukrainian intelligence expressed confidence that the United States will maintain military support for Kiev, including the supply of additional air defense systems. He was vindicated on that point. Once again, this call comes from Bloomberg. And that he says Trump's position is consistent, and that despite the rhetoric, he does not see signs to an end of cooperation. And he also coupled these statements with the idea that the Russians are running out of missiles, because the Russians are always 3 days away from being out of missiles, as we all know. And he thinks that the Russians can be pressured on that front, that their supplies are running low, that they might be forced to come to the bargaining table because of military-industrial reasons, which I simply do not see being the case. But I think with all of this, with the palace intrigue, as it were, that Budanov is trying to ingratiate himself to Washington, and that it might be the wisest option if Trump wants to pursue the option that he is, at least publicly states he wants to do, which is we're going to be so tough on Russia until they come crawling and begging for negotiations that, Putin hasn't said some very nice things and blah, blah, blah. But I do think, listening to Budanov, and he did have a kernel of truth in his statement that the strategic situation in Ukraine is not favorable and that some lands were probably irrevocably lost. And that's very appealing rhetoric to Trump, in my opinion. But to look at a broader situation in terms of Ukraine's overall strategy, I mean, who are we kidding ourselves? You can have this back and forth about are we getting the Patriots, or are we not getting the Patriots, are we getting defensive weapons only, what's it going to look like? As it stands out, the Ukrainians can hold in their current position, hope that Trump sticks to his word, which, with how back and forth he's been, it might not be the best option there. And we can look at depleted HIMAR ammo, no Taurus missiles, air defense depleted, a promise of, 10 Patriot missiles? Or we could look at a situation where the Ukrainians fall back, let's just say 20 kilometers, and fortify the front there, even just to hold out a little bit longer, because at this point it won't save them, it won't reverse the course of the war, but they can hold on just a little bit longer, they can inflict just a little bit more damage on Russia, and they can squeeze just a little bit more money out of the West, and just keep it going. But, I mean, otherwise, what's the option here? But I think one of the more entertaining stories, before I get into the Yermak scandal, the so-called Yermak scandal, is the targeting of the TCC centers, which is the military recruitment centers, which have been responsible for some of the infamous conscription cases, the dragging off the streets, the forced mobilization, and the Russians have been hammering those targets with drones. On top of the other infrastructure military targets, they've been hammering these TCC targets. Most recently, the ones in Kremenchug, and which is more towards eastern Ukraine, in Dnipropetrovsk, closer to Dnipropetrovsk, not in it. And that is the third strike just this week, along with Kryvyi Rog and Poltava, uh, all of which are in more eastern Ukraine. And there were also strikes in Vinnytsia, which is in western Ukraine, which led to them announcing that they are suspending their operation at their main office because of the tense situation and ensuring the safety of citizens, which they suddenly have a newfound concern for, it seems, after all these years. And that they are starting new offices and setting up new administrative centers in order to continue out their operations. And across Ukrainian social media, Telegram in particular, there's been celebration of these strikes, and that in terms of winning the hearts and minds of the people, this has been the most progress the Russians have made thus far, which is attacking the people who are dragging not only them, but say their fathers, their sons, their husbands, their brothers, etc., onto the front lines where the lifespan, the life expectancy is abysmal, frankly. But to get into the palace politics in Kiev and the possible shuffling of the cabinet, you do have The Economist and Politico putting out one article followed by another attacking Yermak and trying to paint him as the power behind the power with Zelensky and that he's responsible for many of the more authoritarian and less desirable things we're seeing coming out of Ukraine right now, and that he is responsible for a growing atmosphere of disarray, and he is a driving threat behind factionalism, purges, and political infighting, and that he wants Shmihal, the prime minister, removed and replaced with First Deputy PM Svira Danko, and that they're bringing up corruption charges surrounding the deputy prime minister, Chernyshov, and that he also is pushing for the removal of Budnov. And the way The Economist is painting him, which I don't know if you want to believe it, but knowing some of the things I know about Yermak, is that he's de facto the prime minister, that he is the man in charge right after Zelensky. He is the second in command, and that he is a source of ire for the Washington at least, and that they might be pushing to remove him, and that Yermak might be on his way out soon, as we might see, and that during his attempts to remove remove Yermak, what we have here is the White House stepping in on Budanov's side in the feud between Budanov and Yermak, I should say, and that with the shakeup in Kiev, in the internal political structure, the Americans are very dedicated to having Budanov stay in his place, which once again does bolster my ongoing theory that as time goes on, as Zelensky's grip on power starts to slip, Budanov might be their man they go to. He's the guy who can put a stopper in the conflict, help rebuild the country, and prepare for the next round in 5 to 10 years. Which, at this point, I would say is Washington's strategy. That's why Trump talks so tough. That's why he wants just a clean ceasefire and everyone just stop what they're doing right now and we'll go on, blah blah blah. And the other major news before I get into Trump is that the Russians on the 10th of July assassinated an SBU colonel by the name of Ivan Voronich, who was shot and killed on the street of Kiev. It was by an unidentified assassin. Eventually, of course, it came back to the Russians, and that he was responsible for helping plan many of the strikes inside Russia, and he was not liquidated by the Kiev regime, that it was not an internal op, but it was a Russian operative who managed to take him out. And it does show the further reach that the Russians have rebuilt since 2014, because in terms of being able to carry out operations like that in Ukraine, their ability was greatly diminished, even in the lead up to the Maidan. We didn't have that kind of situation happen, but they are now able to, at least on some scale, carry out these kind of attacks. And that's also combined with strikes on SBU outposts and headquarters across Ukraine, as well as attacks on the TCC. So it does look like they are attacking the administrative infrastructure more and more as well, which might suggest, and we'll see how this plays out over the coming weeks and months, that they are pushing for a more institutional collapse of Ukraine as this war goes on and as negotiations look less and less likely. But also, this past week, Trump and Macron both had their respective phone calls with Putin. And Macron said he plans on continuing contact with Putin, hoping for a sooner ceasefire. The statement coming from the Elysee Palace was the president agrees to coordinate their further approaches and hold talks again in the near future, continue discussions, adding that Macron called for agreeing to a ceasefire in Ukraine as soon as possible and engaging in talks on any of the conflict. So that does signal there is some direction in Europe where they are starting to adopt parts of Trump's plan, as opposed to, say, in Germany with Friedrich Merz, who is once again beating the war drum and begging Trump to stay the course, and that if we just maintain transatlantic unity, the Russians will crack soon and we'll be able to impose whatever terms we want on them. Where Macron, which I don't think is surprising, is taking the more conciliatory role. He's the one who's going to reach out to Putin. He's the one who's going to engage in the formal diplomacy. And I don't think European attempts at diplomacy will go much beyond that. But getting into Trump and Putin had one of their famous hour-long phone calls. And coming from Ushakov, he stated that Trump once again raised the issue of a swift end of the conflict. Putin emphasized the efforts ongoing for a political negotiated settlement. The statement from Ushakov was, in general, the conversation between the two leaders, as always, was on the same wavelength. Open, businesslike, and concrete. The presidents naturally will continue their communication. This has been agreed upon. But the statements coming from Trump is that he wasn't very happy with his phone call with Putin. And he was saying this in terms of when he was asked if he would stay the course in Ukraine by one of these media talking heads. We've been helping them, we'll continue to help them, he says, regarding Ukraine. I told you I was very unhappy with my call with Putin. It just seems like he wants to go all the way and keep killing people. It's not good. It's not good. I wasn't happy with him. So Trump has been taking this very tisk 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 line on Putin, which has been signaling more support for Ukraine and more aggressive position towards Russia. All while BlackRock is starting to cash out on its assets and starting to pull out its funds and pull itself out from the Ukrainian Recovery Fund, which does signal on the investor side that they aren't confident that this war is going to go in any direction that might favor Ukraine at this point. But Trump has continued with his back and forth, starting with earlier last week, the Patriot shipments to Ukraine were paused for strategic review. And according to The Guardian, that's where these figures come from, U.S. Patriot missile stockpiles are at 25% of the required levels. In 2023, U.S. Army projected that they would need 3,376 missiles to fully support its forces. With the oversight memo, it raised that number to 13,733 due to the ongoing conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. Lockheed Martin, who are the sole producers of the missiles for the Patriot systems, only made 500 units last year, and their current contract is going to boost that output to 650 with no clear timeline on when that's supposed to be. And continue on with that, so that news came out about the withholding of Patriots for strategic review from the Pentagon. Trump has his little song and dance to the media, as always, and he scolds Putin. He says, Putin's always very nice to us when he talks, but he keeps doing the same thing. I feel like he's feeding us a lot of BS. He used the actual word, which, for the sake of the algorithm and how sensitive our hosts here that we're on this website can be, I will spare using the actual word. You guys all know what it is, which made Trump posture towards saying, if that's going to be the case, we're going to provide Ukraine with weapons, defensive weapons only. Now, that ended up being a total of only providing 10 Patriot missiles, which is not enough to even stave off one wave of Russian attacks. And it does go to show that American stockpiles are woefully underprepared, and that they are simply not in a position to continue on with the arms and armament. Now, they are putting pressure on the Europeans to provide more arms and to pay for the transfer of arms. And the new scheme right now is, which we talked about this back on the show even before Trump got into office, Trump will launder his support for their Europe. He'll have them buy the arms, which will count towards their 5% military spending, of course, and then ship them to the United States, putting pressure on Germany to ship their Patriot missiles. Ship them to Ukraine. Putting pressure on Germany to ship their Patriot missiles to Ukraine, so on and so forth. Which, if there's anyone who's going to cooperate with such demand, it would be Merz. Even Olaf Scholz had some reservations about that, and that could go for a number of reasons. You do have to recall that even before Scholz took office, he was a bit more skeptical of, say, some of the more Atlanticist foreign policy points, but he quickly fell in line once he assumed office, of course. In fact, he fell so much in line that we got Annalena Baerbock as German foreign minister for 4 years before she moved on to her promotion as uh, General Secretary of the UN General Assembly. Uh, it's amazing how these people fail upwards. And as part of Trump's ongoing feud with the Russians, his ongoing disappointment with Putin, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Zaharova announced that the U.S. postponed the third round of talks with Russia, and that there is no set date in mind due to removing mutual irritants. And that's what Zaharova described the situation as. And she continued on saying, despite this, Moscow does still see signals that the U.S. wants to restore ties, and that previous rounds of negotiations were held in Istanbul both back in February and April, and that the U.S. has not canceled the talks, contacts are ongoing, that they've only simply been postponed, and that this is probably part of Trump's hardballing method, that he wants to bring them to the table on his terms, blah, 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 which goes into this whole nonsense with the 500% secondary sanctions on the countries trading Russian oil, which Trump pushed for, and of course he pushed for him to have the power of exemption so he could enforce them as seeing fit for the strategic implications of that. So that is something that they are debating. I'll have a hard time believing if it actually goes through, simply because of the 500 number. I think that's too off-putting, especially once you get over a certain number. The sanctions, the tariffs are going to be, and this would be more of a tariff in this case, but the sanctions and the tariffs are going to uh, cap out at the same effective rate, whatever that might be. So I could see them them being Congress negotiating that down to a more reasonable rate. But it does make you wonder, with the past few weeks, past few months, particularly regarding the rhetoric towards Iran, but I would say more so Russia in this case, because Trump has always had a more hawkish tone on the Iranians because of his connections to the Israel lobby. But when it comes to his recent policy in Ukraine, not that I had much faith, he did give me some hope, and perhaps I played too much into that, and we can talk about some of the earlier episodes this year. But, I mean, Trump's entire presidency thus far, it's been 6 months. In fact, the day I'm recording right now, the 13th of July 2025, is actually the 1 year anniversary of the first attempt on Trump's life. So that's an interesting retrospect to take into consideration. But just in these past 6 months, it's been a roller coaster, been up and down. I've wanted to give Trump the benefit of the doubt simply because he's the man in the office. He's the man who hypothetically can make the decision. So I want to, in some ways, hope for the best and, like I said, let the situation play out. But as time goes on, the fruits are more and more bitter. I'm not saying that I think, oh, we should have, let Kamala get in there, blah, blah, blah. I'm not saying that Trump is a complete wash. I certainly have many criticisms of him. And even if that is the case, even if Trump is a complete failure, which I know that some of you might have that more strong opinion, I completely respect that. I know you certainly air that in the comments, and I appreciate that because it does help me think through my own views, which I thank you guys for, and I hope that what I do here helps you guys do the same. That it helps you logically work through what you actually think about these situations. That's, I would say, one of the main reasons I do this program. From the side that actually makes the show and puts it out for the public to see. But even if it was the case, even if Trump was a complete failure and not worth it at all, at that point it's no different. What does it matter whether Cackles, Kamala, or Donald Trump was in office? It just doesn't matter at that point. Maybe some things take on a different flavor. Maybe this is part of the reason the establishment kind of let the Trump effect take its course because they knew that there would be a number of inevitable crises that would come to a head, and they wanted the taste of failure to have a touch of MAGA in it instead of a touch of rainbow progressivism. I don't know. That very well could be the case. But it does feel like these past few months that Lindsey Graham has effectively been the national security advisor. I know that Rubio officially holds both roles in the interim because Mike Waltz was allegedly moved to the UN. We'll see how that actually works out because that does seem to still be up in the air. Doesn't seem to be much organization in terms of the way the cabinet is run. But I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it does feel like effectively Lindsey Graham's the national security advisor. I don't know. Maybe he's going after that position, even though giving up a seat in the Senate that he seems to have a lock-in with the South Carolina Republican Party for whatever reason is tempting, especially when he can effectively serve the same role and also serve as an ally in the Senate for Trump, who would also be the first to snake him at when the opportunity arises. You have to remember, going back to 2015, this guy was always he never liked Trump. He was a never Trumper. Blah blah blah. But the minute Trump got elected, he was on board. The minute Trump fell out of favor with January 6th and all that, he was back to his principled neoconservatism. Now that Trump's back, and when Trump was on the ascendancy, he rides his coattails because that is the kind of person Lindsey Graham is. He chases after power. And I don't know, maybe he's gunning for a position to replace a cabinet secretary. Maybe that's in consideration right here. Or maybe he's trying to posture himself for a position in a hypothetical future Republican administration, let's say Marco Rubio, who at this point, I think looking at some of the roles he's been put in, they're trying to build a presidential resume for him because they ran him. He was the peanut candidate. His slogan was literally for a new American century back in 2016. Um, Trump wiped the floor with him and the rest of the Republican nominees back in 2015. But now he has a seasoned career in the Senate. He's made nice with Trump. He can sit as foreign secretary or secretary of state, I should say. Have his chops as national security advisor, at least in the interim. And then he can come to 2028 and be the next face of the Republican Party where he can have the MAGA face with the neoconservative foreign policy. I think that's a very real possibility looking at Rubio right now. But who knows? And this does also come at a time when some people speculate that, not to get too much into, say, the politics of Washington and the power struggles in the White House, not to detract too much from the current subject, but some people speculate that Vance has been a bit sidelined. And I'm not saying that as somebody who loves Vance or is necessarily a big supporter. I certainly have my reservations about him. The more I learn about him, the more skeptical I am about him. His Peter Thiel connections, that's never good news. You could say he's a reasonable level head compared to the rest of the administration, even though that's not saying much these days. But it could be that Rubio could be the favored successor because despite Trump's bluster, no, he cannot run again. No, Trump is not going to find a loophole or force Congress to amend the Constitution to allow him to stand for another term when he's 83 years old or 84 years old or however old he'll be when he actually is finally out of office. But no, I think what we're seeing right now when it comes to Rubio is he's being set up for 2028. He's being set up. It's maybe not even to win 2028, but he's being set up for a presidential run and a possible presidency at some point in the near future. He's a young guy. I think he's in his 50s, maybe pushing 60s. But point being is he's certainly at the prime age to seek the presidential office and certainly now has the resume for it. But getting back to the ultimate point, we did see this after the so-called 12-day war between Iran and Israel that Trump came in, he dropped his bombs, and now a tentative ceasefire has held since. That Trump would think he can do the hardball tactics against the Russians, and that if we just saber rattle enough, if we just hoot and holler enough, and just are blusterous enough, eventually the Russians will get scared and come to the bargaining table because hey, it worked with the Iranians. Even though I suppose the definition of success, this it just depends on how you want to paint that. But the last story I want to cover, just even tangentially to either Russia or Ukraine, before moving on to some of the news out of the Caucasus, was the story of a so-called 1 million Indian migration to Russia that was doing the rounds among the usual suspects, even in the alternative media, as it were, and everyone's like, "Oh, I can't believe it. Why would the Russians succumb to the same migration scheme that the West did?" Well, it turned out to be a fake story, more or less. It was a proposal from a head of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry for the Ural Mountain region, and as it stands now, there's no significant Russian push among, say, a federal level to have 1 million Indian migrants or even guest workers at that point. But the story, once again, comes from some comments from a local official who has nothing to do with immigration. As it stands right now, the Russians do plan on having a total of about 235,000 migrants over the course of the next year. Now, how many of them will actually be on a so-called pathway to citizenship versus how many of them are just temporarily there for whatever reason, that's not broken down in these statistics. But of that, about 72,000 of them are Indian nationals, uh, which, as of this past week, only about 13% of the India quota has been met, and it doesn't look like that's going to shift rapidly. As it stands now, when it comes to migrants, especially migratory workers, it looks like the Russian government is pushing for North Korean guest workers out of everything. I know that previously it's been Central Asians, however, given some of the recent controversies, some might think back to the Crocus Hall, and some might think even back to Operation Spiderweb, where there's some Central Asians who either wittingly or unwittingly participated in attacks against Russian military targets. That many of these nations have fallen out, and it's been policy for a number of years that a lot of these Central Asian countries would expel the dregs of their society to Russia or to whoever else would take them. And even with situations in Azerbaijan, you had a lot of migrants come from there, and they formed these ethnic gangs and these black markets, and we're seeing the consequences of that right now. And I have to say, if we do truly live in a system, if this current era we live in, if the global economy truly does rely on migrant labor, truthfully, Koreans are probably some of the best people you could ask for as guest workers. Uh, and that's not even a North or South thing. That's just Koreans. I would say even just East Asians in general. I don't think that you could ask for much better in terms of that. And Russia has a history of bringing in North Korean guest workers, even all the way back to like 2007. And now that ties between the countries have greatly increased, I can imagine this will continue on further. And like I said, there's worse possibilities out there by far. But to move on to the Caucasus and to tie this back to the story I just discussed there, the police, Russian police, do continue to crack down on Azeri criminal rings in Russia, and the most recent bust was in the city of Tver, where they busted a group that was selling counterfeit cigarettes and alcohol. And they brewed the drinks themselves and poured them in the bottles, glued labeled popular brands on them, and sold them as high quality originals. Uh, this was a ring that operated from at least January 2022 until its dismantlement in July of 2025, which is this current month. And it was involved the illegal circulation of unmarked tobacco products and knockoff alcohol products, and that they face up to 20 years in prison, and that a number of these criminal raids on these Azeri-owned businesses and these Azeri criminal networks has prompted just absolute unhinged behavior from the Azeri government. Maybe not so much from Aliyev himself, even though he has made some comments, but especially from parliamentarians in Azerbaijan. It has been quite the reaction. And even the cooperative meeting between members of parliament in Russia and Azerbaijan was canceled when the story did first come out with the raids against the Azeri crime rings. Now, this comes from a Azeri politician named Mirza Baliev, who laid out everything from a century old chauvinistic policy of Russia, the so called skinheads of the 90s, the war of aggression in Ukraine, and the hatred of Russians towards Turks and Muslims. And this has sparked some pretty harsh retaliation against Russian nationals who are in Azerbaijan. Many of whom are there, not only on business, but because they are of a more distant persuasion. Because after the war with Ukraine broke out, and after the first wave of mobilization took place, many Russians went to countries that they had easy access to. You have the same case with a lot of Russians who had gone to Serbia in that case, a lot of them who had gone to Georgia or other parts of Central Asia. But Georgia and Azerbaijan were some of the big receptacles for those. And now you are getting street violence against these people, and you are getting even government crackdowns with random arrests, interrogations, etc. against these people. And they've recently started targeting Sputnik journalists and accusing them of spy work and operating in the interest of the Russian state. All the normal accusations that you would see in this kind of case. And the Russians in kind have began responding with cracking down on Azeris who arrive at Russian airports, increased security checks among Azeri migrants and Azeri immigrants. And I think the Azeri population of Russia is about that of the Armenian population of Russia, which we're looking at about 2 million here. But in all of this, we go back to the big elephant in the room, which is collaboration with Ukraine. As we went back to that one tirade from one of the deputies of the Azeri parliament, support for Ukraine against Russia's bitter, unprovoked invasion, you do have to wonder how much of an instrumental role they played in particularly drone warfare. Because to give you a brief history for those of you who might not know or those of you who might not remember, the kind of drone warfare we see today really started with Turkey in Syria, where they would provide these rebel groups in Syria, these terrorist groups in Syria that they were supporting, with these kamikaze drones, and they would use them to harass particularly Syrian and Russian air bases in order to get them to waste air defense resources, waste air defense missiles. And in a way, I suppose you could say the Russians got a taste of what this kind of warfare would look like in Ukraine, on a much smaller scale, admittedly, by dealing with these Turkish proxies in Syria. But that escalated when you had the Artsakh War in 2020 between Armenia, or the Artsakh forces nominally backed by Armenia at that point, even though the Armenian state didn't do much under Pashinyan to help them, against Azerbaijan, where they were getting slammed with these drones. And this all comes when you had the offer from the Russians to reintegrate or to further integrate Russian and Armenian air defenses, in particular in response to the advances in drone warfare that they had learned about in Syria. And Pashinyan and the Armenians rebuffed them, and they paid the price for it. But you do have to wonder, with all of this, because these Azeris naturally have been at the receiving end of, say, Turkey's new military technology and tactics, how much of that support they passed on to Ukraine. Because much of what the Azeris do, well, I'm not saying they have no autonomy, they act as a proxy of the Turkish state. There's that um, one people, two states, or one people, two governments saying that goes when it comes to talking about unity between the Turks and the Azeris, where many on both sides do desire further integration, and they do view themselves as part of a greater Turkic civilizational state. And that depending on how brazen the Turks want to be in this situation, they could push that envelope further and further and continue using Azerbaijan as their proxy. And there's not much, particularly the Europeans, can do about it because of how much of a critical energy hub the Azeris serve as, and because of their geographic position. And even the Russians find themselves in a bit of a bind because of the level of economic collaboration or economic integration between the two countries. Even though, if it were to come to blows, obviously the Russians, being a much larger, resource rich country, would be able to do without the Azeris. But as it stands now, it's in their interests to keep a cooperative relationship with them and not having to engage in conflict, whether outright military conflict or diplomatic conflict with them. But some interesting statistics regarding the Azeri economy. About 60% of Azerbaijan's food and consumer imports rely on Russian or Eurasian trade routes. They have about $3.4 billion in bilateral trade with Russia in 2023, and especially for a nation their size, $3.4 billion is quite a bit. Russia is part of their gas network, and they channel key gas exports, and that over 700,000 Azeris work in Russia and send home more than $1 billion annually in remittances. And if it were once again to come to blows, either diplomatically or militarily, the Russians would have the edge with that. And the Azeris do themselves no favor in the region. While they might have Pashinyan on a dog leash and that he's going to bend over to every demand to give up more and more border villages, they've even managed to infuriate the Georgians, who just up until recently would have been caught dead cooperating with, say, either the Russians or the Armenians, and that even during the Artsakh War, the Georgians blocked their airspace for Russian aid to get to Armenia. But ever since the foiled color revolution in Georgia and the success of Georgian Dream, I'm not saying that Georgia has become a pro-Russian country, but they've taken a much more pragmatic stance towards their most prominent neighbor. And that even with this, there is a Georgian minority in Azerbaijan that is subject to the same kind of harassment and persecution that, say, other minorities in Azerbaijan face as well. So they've lost friends among the Georgians. They've lost friends, not that they ever had them, among the actual populace of Armenia, the government notwithstanding. And they continue to push the envelope on the Russians. And not only that, but also push the envelope on the Iranians. Because there's speculation on top of all this, even though they adamantly deny it, that they were collaborators in the Israeli attacks. Even if they were not used for a launch site for any drones or missiles, I have a hard time believing there was not some sort of staging that took place in Azerbaijan when it came to the 12-day war. And that I haven't seen a country that is so vulnerable, it's not a very big country, not a very powerful country, be so eager to antagonize all of its neighbors at once, unless they sincerely believe in the one nation, two governments mantra and expect that Turkey will intervene, even militarily, to bail them out if they do trade blows with, say, the Iranians or the Russians. Which I'm not saying is likely, but is certainly a possibility. It could. That situation always could boil over. You never know when something like that might happen. But to continue on the situation, while you have finally, after a number of years, a more assertive response from the Russians and the Iranians, at least to some degree on the Iranian part, towards the question of Azerbaijan acting like this pariah state, acting like this rogue state, the Armenians continue to fold in on themselves, and Pashinyan's government continues to attack its own people and its own religious and cultural institutions. And I'm referring in particular to the persecution of the hierarchs of the Armenian church as it stands right now. And you see this happen in Moldova, you see this happen in Ukraine. This is nothing new. This is a typical counter-revolution tactic where, of course, the interested parties get involved and that they do crack down on any vectors of opposition. And especially in Armenia, it's going to be the church. And for some historical context, even beyond, say, the religiosity of the Armenian population as a whole, which even compared to most ostensibly Christian nations, they are a pretty actively practicing Christian nation as it stands right now, not just in name, but in terms of actual practice of the faith. The Catholicos, who is the head of the Armenian church, the head hierarch of the Armenian church, has traditionally served as an ethnarch of the Armenian people. And this goes back to the days of Ottoman subjugation, where under the system, the various peoples, whenever they would need to make appeals to the overall government of the Ottoman Empire, whenever they needed to make their voice heard or tried to appeal to the authorities that they were under, they spoke through an ethnarch. And in many cases, we saw this with, say, the Greeks, some of the other Balkan populations, the Levantine Christians in Syria. A lot of those would be the Christian hierarchs who would speak on behalf of their ethnic group. And what the Catholicos of Armenia said, Karakin II, said the anti-church campaign by Armenian authorities threatens the country's independent statehood and national unity. He was giving a speech before clergy, and he emphasized the Armenian church cannot remain silent. Threats of national identity, homeland security, and the distortion of history, as well as the violated rights of the Armenians of Artsakh and the prisoners held in Azerbaijan, and that the actions by the Armenian authorities are systematic in nature and directed against the church itself, despite attempts to present it as actions against individuals. And once again, what you have right here is a collaboration with government Armenia, because I don't know what you could call it, and I've said again many times, and I'll say it again, that Pashinyan is probably the greatest living traitor to his nation, high bar by today's standards, that is alive today, and he can't help but himself, he can't refrain himself from attacking the most trusted institution in Armenia, the one that, even like I said, if they're not particularly religious, that was the organization that preserved their nation, the organization that preserved their ethnic identity through times of some of the worst persecution that history has ever seen. I mean, even beyond the Armenian genocide of the early 20th century, just life for the subjugated people, the Ottomans, it was horrific. Probably one of the most evil empires to ever exist, and I don't think that can really be overstated. But moving on to news out of Europe, because it does seem that the Armenian state is on the path to self-destruction, possibly by the end of the century, if this does keep up and there is not any sort of significant change. We have some news out of Europe, starting with the Clown Coalition, and that is, of course, the idea forwarded particularly by Keir Starmer, to an extent Macron, and that this is their idea for their multinational contingent of 50,000 troops, and that it will be ready to be sent into Ukraine at the end of the armed conflict, according to the Washington Post. And this was decided at a meeting in Rome by the so-called Coalition of the Willing, which I think the coalition of the clowns, or the clown coalition is a much more fitting name, and that it will continue to work in Paris and then move to London and then uh, eventually establish its operation in Kiev. And at this point, there's no specific details on who's going to be involved, who's going to contribute what. There's just 30 countries that are part of this so-called coalition of the willing, and that they are all dedicated to providing arms and logistics and support to the Ukrainians to ensure security. All the stuff we've heard before, all the bluster that's simply not going to happen, and all the reason for the to delay negotiations, because at that point, if there is going to be Western troops that are going to move into Ukraine, the Russians are not going to agree to any sort of ceasefire or peace agreement because that is simply off the table. And like I said, I don't think that they're seriously considering going to Ukraine. This is simply a move to stymie negotiations and secure their position for just blind support for Ukraine, as we've seen over and over and over again from the Europeans. And on top of the coalition of the willing, there is a new drone team for Ukraine as well. And you have Turkey as the most recent member to join. So that includes currently 20 countries. This is a statement from the Latvian Ministry of Defense. Among them, Latvia, the UK, Ukraine, Australia, Belgium, Czechia, Denmark, France, Estonia, Italy, New Zealand, Canada, Lithuania, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Poland, Turkey, Germany, and Sweden. And that they will be required as part of this coalition to fork over about 3 billion euros a year, this year at least, to Ukraine in order to sustain their drone program. And that's also on top of the EU's 2.3 billion agreement in terms of more aid for Ukraine. Um, and this is one of the installments that is supposed to eventually add up to $18.1 billion in euros over the course of whatever time frame they've established. They are very loose in the time frames of this. The UK is pledging to transfer 5,000 air defense missiles to Ukraine, totaling about $3.4 billion. This is something they agreed to in Rome, expecting a repayment for that over the course of 19 years. I see two main problems with that. Number one, do the British even have 5,000 air defense missiles to spare? Number two, will there be a Ukraine around to repay 19 years worth of debt? And even despite all of that, even despite all of Trump's rhetoric, Politico reports that the EU simply does not trust that Trump is dedicated to Europe. And how, for once, I hope Politico is right about this. I hope the bureaucrats are right about this. I hope Trump is ready to walk away tomorrow. But I think that is foolish optimism, and I suppose in their case, a bit of a foolish pessimism on their part, to think that that might even be the case. Um, so, citing Politico once again, U.S. foreign policy under Trump is perceived as unpredictable, which makes it difficult to develop a stable strategy towards Ukraine. I agree that Trump's everything about his administration is a roller coaster, but once you can really zoom out and get a bird's eye view on the situation, that there's pretty clear continuity policy on a number of issues, particularly foreign policy, and that his bluster and his rhetoric should be disregarded when it comes to actually making a serious analysis of what might actually happen with Ukraine. I mean, I think this should have been obvious going all the way back to the suspension of ISR after the White House feud between Trump and Zelensky, where ISR was suspended for a total of 6 days, and then of course there was the meeting at the Pope's funeral back in April, where they made nice and had their little 15-minute meeting, and Trump gave his warm remarks to Zelensky, so on and so forth. And that despite all of this, despite a public blow-up, the U.S. has stayed the course and will continue to stay the course under Donald Trump. Like I said, as much as I want to be wrong about that, as much as I would prefer not to happen, that is simply the case that we're looking at right here. And that the Europeans can really kvetch all they want, but they're going to get what they're going to get. And I think that, Mark Rutte's daddy comment probably sealed the deal, that Trump is not going to pull out of Europe, and that the Europeans are going to continue on saying that NATO is a possible defensive alliance against China. You're already seeing rhetoric point towards that right now as well. And that America needs to stay the course with Europe because not only are we going to solve the war in Ukraine, we're also going to help you confront the impending threat of China or whatever. And that the Eurocrats, as long as they are able to hold on to power, will dig up some reason in order to justify the transatlantic relationship that really benefits neither side and that really makes fools and vassals out of the Europeans and makes the Americans look like, in many ways, a modern Ottoman Empire to return to it, where it is just demanding more and more for the vassals. At first, it was paid 2.5% in defense spending to meet your NATO requirements. Now we want you to pay 5%. Now we want you to invest that 5% into the Americans' arms industry. Now we want you blah 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 blah. They want to shift more of the burden while providing less of the imperial benefits. And because the position of the current European elite relies so much on the transatlantic relationship and America being the guarantor, your Starmers, your Macrons, your Mertzes, your Rutes, your Ursulas are willing to lap up everything the Americans give them. And you see this in the current tariff dispute. Sure, they might be puffing out their chests and talking strong during all of this, but at the end of the day, they're going to take whatever the Americans put on a plate and feed to them because the Americans are their guarantors when it comes to at least their regimes remaining in power. I'm not saying they're the guarantors of European nations because that's the case. Looking at the current crises in Europe, particularly when it comes to the migration crisis, they have profoundly failed beyond all belief. But speaking of failing beyond all belief, we have 12,000 German companies that have gone bankrupt within the last 6 months since the start of 2025. And this is German bankruptcy law, which is much more strict than some of the bankruptcy laws that you would expect out of the Anglo-Saxon world. So this is a continuation of the trend that we've been seeing with the deindustrialization. The recession in Europe, let's call it what it is. It's a joke to think that's anything but a recession in Europe right now. I think anything else is cope. And speaking of the strong institutions of Europe, Ursula had her no confidence vote. Now, she did survive. This was particularly over the European Union's policy handling COVID-19 and certain medical responses to it. I'm sure you could figure out which ones I might be referring to. Orban was outspokenly for the no confidence vote, wanting to get Ursula out, getting her to step down. Maloney, of course, sold out again, saying, "Oh, we're going to not vote for the no confidence motion," which ended up total tally of 175 for 360 against, with 18 abstentions. But the coalition that's still in charge of the European Union with Ursula is still pretty frail, and that it likely is not going to last much longer. I think Ursula's burned much for credibility, especially now that we're in the Trump era again, as it were. I think they're going to want a fresh new face, especially somebody who Trump can rub elbows with, get along, a Macron type figure, if you will, that will be much more appealing and can balance the position of having to take whatever humiliating deal that the U.S. feeds them and also maintaining a position of faux strength while gaining the quote-unquote support of Donald Trump. And I don't know who that might be, but I do expect a Macron-style figure. Maybe they're just biding their time until 2027 when Macron is term limited, so he can become, the next head of the European Commission, and oust Ursula and have her finally step down and go her own way and be out of our sight and out of mind. But I don't want to see a future in which Macron is in Ursula's role, because that is disgusting, frankly. That'd be even. I'll take Ursula any day, because at least there's some straightforwardness, and also she doesn't command much power and respect. So, yeah, you gotta take what you can get. Macron in that position is going to be insufferable. And the worst part is Trump and Macron, or Macron at least knows how to flatter Trump and stroke his ego. In many ways, get what he wants out of him. Moving on to some news out of Eastern Europe, I think there was an interesting statement given by the outgoing president of Poland, Andrzej Duda, as he is slated to be replaced by Nawrocki in the coming weeks here after the most recent round of Polish elections. And he felt pretty snubbed by the Europeans and by NATO in general when it came to the supply of arms to Ukraine. Uh, I'll read his full statement that he gave to Polsat News, and that is, I believe both the Ukrainians and our allies simply think that Rezhov Airport and our highways belong to them as if they were theirs. And looking at the position of Poland in NATO, effectively that is the case. These are NATO-owned highways. You are simply a colony of a larger system. You are simply a vassal state of a larger system. You're not sovereign. He goes on to say, well, it's not theirs, it's ours. Therefore, if someone doesn't like it, we shut it and say goodbye. This is how we do renovation. We close the airport in Rezhov and deliver it to Ukraine by sea, air. I don't know. Drop us under protection. Do something about it. Get creative if you think you don't need us. Especially, for example, the fact that we were not invited to important international bodies. In the meantime, decisions were being made about delivering aid through our territory. I thought it was a scandal. So, of course, Duda waits until he's almost out of office to bring up this issue of NATO and, I suppose, to a certain extent, the European Union trampling over Poland's sovereignty to the degree that it exists. And he's just ranting and blowing off steam now that he is in his lame duck term and that he won't have to face the consequences of these comments because he'll likely sail off into retirement, maybe find some other establishment job. Or I'm not sure how Polish term limits work if he's able to run again after sitting out a term, but he is letting out, in my opinion, what on the face of it, yeah, is a very reasonable statement that he is saying, yes, you're treating us like dogs. You're making decisions about our territory to support your war. And of course, it was a war that Duda and the Polish establishment supported as well. But can we at least get a say? And like I said, that might be an honorable statement. That might be a worthwhile statement if he wasn't waiting until he was going to be out of office in just a few weeks to make a statement like that. In that case, it comes off as just him venting and being whiny and a bit impotent because he is in his lame duck term. But on the other hand, Zelensky met with Donald Tusk and said that Poland must remain a key logistical transit hub and that there must be international assistance continued to Ukraine. And this also all coincides with the Volyn massacre Remembrance Day that was passed by the Polish legislature, and that Nawrocki also campaigned and spoke in detail about when it comes to remembering the massacres in Volyn in the 1940s that were conducted by Ukrainian nationalist organizations, and that Duda, as part of that same interview, said, "Don't be afraid. We don't need compensation." Saying that he doesn't want the Ukrainians to recognize or apologize for it. He just wants the Poles to have their day of remembrance, taking a very weak position, especially as, like I said, even though Poland is not pro-Russia in any sense of the word, especially his frustrations with Ukraine and support for the Ukrainian war effort grow in Poland. This was, I do think that implementing a day of remembrance of the Volyn massacre, especially at this point, was political pandering. That it was posturing. It isn't really out of any concern for the actual historic event in question. It just does give some leverage for them venting about the situation in Ukraine, which once again I don't fault them for. I don't fault the Polish people for supporting this because in terms of the atrocities during the 1940s, this is one that simply does not get talked about enough. It's one of the overlooked ones, and that it, it's as bad as some of the other ones that are the sensationalist ones that everyone has drilled in their heads from the time that they're in grade school. But this one we don't know about. And I'm not saying that foreigners are obligated to know every bit of every other country's history, but point being is, you figure with as much attention as we give to that time and the atrocity that took place, then there would at least be some passing mention of what happened to Poland. And like I said, I can sympathize with the Polish people's frustration on this, and that I can sympathize with their desire for a day of remembrance. But I think the way that it's being employed right now is a completely political move, and not even to a good end either, because it's just wanting a retooling of what support for Ukraine looks like, and not just disengaging with the conflict altogether, realizing that it's simply not worthwhile to keep this fight. You're not going to get any of our more of our arms and armaments and money while we house and feed your people, many of whom are ungrateful for, because there has been some tensions between Ukrainian refugees and Polish locals. That has been one of the places where those issues have really come to a head. And like I said, I sympathize with the general frustration that comes from even some of the Polish officials, but I do think it's too little too late from people like Duda. And while I don't have much hope, I hope somebody like Navrotsky can actually capitalize on this and maybe make some slight positive change. But especially given the way the political establishment is in Poland, and also with Donald Tusk being in the halls of power, not, even if you weren't, it wouldn't happen. But especially with him there, it's not going to happen. That Poland is going to continue to be a nation not defined by its own merits, its own history or culture, but simply by the fact that it was once upon a time a so-called victim of the Russians or the Soviet Union or whatever. And that's the fate of a lot of these nations that have really bought hook, line, and sinker into the NATO line, into the Baltic states, and I think Poland especially. It's a shame because once again, it is a nation that has its own history, that has its own culture, that has its own achievements, and not to downplay, say, the individuals or the cultures of any of the given other nations, but I mean, compared to say like Estonia hasn't really made that much of a mark on history. Where Poland could be a nation that defines itself, it continues to choose to be a nation that is defined against another, which is why these projects fail. Which is why, for example, Hungary, which I'll talk about in just a moment here, is able to have a much more sane outlook, both in terms of foreign policy and its own identity, because they are able to take their history and their culture and their nation as is and not define it in opposition. While, yes, there still are the relitigation of historical issues and still are the complaints of even some ongoing issues, Hungary's entire identity is not concerned with, for example, being the anti Romania, which the two countries have a very contentious history. It is a nation that is built on its own merits, its own culture, its own language, its own ideas about the world, its own outlook about the world. Even if it is a fraction of the size and power that it once was at the height of its history, it is still able to maintain that independent identity that a lot of European nations, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, simply are not able to do. And Poland, once again, is a nation that certainly has the makings of some of a country that should be able to behave like Hungary. Now, I know there's a lot of political and geopolitical reasons why that's not allowed to happen. There are a lot of safeguards in place to make sure that does not happen. But talking abstractly, it is a shame that a nation like Poland finds itself in this position where it is taking the marching orders once again. It doesn't have to be like that. They could be a independent Pole. No pun intended. I actually seriously did not intend a pun for that one. When it comes to broader Eurasian relations, they're not like a huge country, not like a power player, but they're nothing to sneeze at either. I think it's a shame that their potential is being squandered, both in terms of economic, industrial, even military, and also cultural and ethnic potential is being squandered once again in these really petty chess games because the Europeans cannot learn how to coexist with the Russians. I think there's a real tragedy in all of it. But as to what can be done, I really can't say. I apologize if I'm leaving you hanging when it comes to solutions on that. But to turn to Hungary, in terms of a nation, even if it is a fraction of the size it once was, even if it's a fraction of the size of Poland, still does have much more of a backbone, I suppose you could put it that way. And there has been an uproar across the Hungarian political class and Hungarian society in general about an ethnic Hungarian who is a dual national between Ukraine and Hungary, who was killed by the TCC during one of their conscription drives because he was beaten by them. And his name was Tamas Sujak. I'm sorry, I misread that, but the president of Hungary, Thomas Sujak, sent a letter to the family of Josef Sebastian, who was the ethnic Hungarian who was killed by the TCC in Berhove, Ukraine. And Sujak, the president of Hungary, Thomas Sujak, said that this cannot happen in Europe. It contradicts all human values that our continent has upheld for centuries. He emphasized that every Hungarian life is valuable and the death of a compatriot is a national tragedy. And a memorial event was held at Budapest at the Ukrainian embassy. Participants lit candles and placed a Ukrainian flag with the inscription "Murderers." The Hungarian Deputy Prime Minister Zolt Semyon was also there. So even among so you'll get this in a lot of countries where there's some popular discontent. For example, Slovakia, before Fico reassumed office, there was quite a bit of popular discontent with the idea of their full-throated support for Ukraine on a governmental level. In Poland, to return to Poland, there is some grassroots level of that. Throughout many of the Balkan states, Bulgaria, I think, is one of the more divided ones. You do see a discontent with the fact that their government is just full-throatedly supporting Ukraine. Romania is another country where you have some grass level opposition to that. But Hungary, you do have a consensus between the officials and the populace where they are skeptical of supporting Ukraine, especially in its war against Russia. They are skeptical of giving more and more to this nation with nothing in return, especially when it's returned with violence against their co-ethnics. Like I said, as far as I know, this man held both a Ukrainian and a Hungarian passport. But even if he was just an ethnic Ukrainian, an ethnic Hungarian caught on the wrong side of the border with Ukraine, he still is a co-ethnic. He still is a compatriot of theirs. And I think they have every right to protest this. He's far from the only person that this happened to. Hungarians early in the war were disproportionately targeted for conscription, and they're not the only ethnic minority in Ukraine. You had Romanians, you had whatever small Polish or Slovak or Bulgarian population as well, and that's not even getting the elephant room of the ethnic Russians still in Ukraine who were heavily targeted for conscription in the east as well. And I haven't seen any country that is so flippant of its neighbors, except maybe Israel, yet expects their unwavering support. And I'm really hoping, and perhaps this is a foolishly optimistic take, that there is some cascading effect where you get more of that discontent on both an official and a populist level across these nations that border Ukraine, and even maybe even a little further west than that, where they say enough is enough. Even they support Ukraine, that we've had our fill. There's nothing more we can do for you, and we're tired of being taken for this free ride. While Zelensky and his cohorts get rich on our dime and march their own people off to death, while they expect us to have our populations armed and at the ready to take their place. Because that's the way things are going right now. And if Zelensky had his way, it would be the Poles and the Slovaks and the Romanians and the Hungarians all marching in to replace those Ukrainian casualties and to meet the same fate. Because that is his view of the world. He thinks he can continue this indefinitely and continue to ride this gravy train until the day he dies. Well, unfortunately, he might have a point if he does get his vaunted government in exile after Ukraine falls. But when it comes to the way things should be done, when it comes to the way things ought to be done if we want a functional countries and civilizations, then it's unacceptable. It is inadmissible. We cannot allow this. But to continue on with just the clown show out of Europe, Georgescu was, of course, indicted for whatever dubious charge they found him on. And in Denmark, because Zelensky is so desperate to get Europe involved in the war, they're beginning a conscription program for women as well, because they had male conscription, they're also beginning female conscription, which it's just a joke. And Look, I suppose you could make the argument that yes, that if we're going to live in a society where women can vote and hold political office, they should be held to that same standard as men. Blah blah blah. And look, I can understand that. But when it comes to the institution of the military and actually accomplishing its stated goal, women in there, even in an auxiliary role, is 99% a joke. And I think whatever role they should play should be auxiliary. But the idea that, number one, you're going to have some sort of conscript army in modern Europe under the current circumstances anyway is ridiculous. But the idea that you're just going to include women, that it's just a clown show. And it just goes into this complete Western confusion on the question of gender and gender roles and all this convoluted nonsense that has been at the forefront of social debate for in this form at least a decade now. But I suppose you could make the argument they implement this program in order to make sure all those trans women can still do their patriotic duty too. Maybe that's the move. And you know what? In that case, I support it. It's very brave. It's very progressive, and I think that they should be more than eager than anyone else to serve their countries, especially in the place of, say, ungrateful sods like myself. But moving on to the Middle East, speaking of conscription, it does appear that the 12-day ceasefire is holding in the most technical terms, but that's not stopping Netanyahu for pushing for further war. He had his little dinner with Trump at the White House on Monday. This is after Trump was doing his 180 with Ukraine and wanting to do a whole turnaround on it. And that Netanyahu is pushing for renewed strikes against Iran, hoping to get Trump's support. Because, of course, even though Trump had the best and brightest and most powerful bombing campaign in the world, lo and behold, the Iranian nuclear program managed to survive. So Israel has to go in and finish the job. And that Netanyahu is buttering up Trump. Mr. Trump, Donald, my best friend, we're going to make sure you get the Nobel Peace Prize. Just let me drop all my ordnance on Iran one last time. Just let me begin the bombing campaign one last time. Make sure you pay for it. Make sure you restock us. Make sure you rearm us. Blah, 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 blah. And as it stands now, I don't know if this is going to escalate into further tensions. One would imagine it would, because Netanyahu is hell bent on this. He's been hell bent on this for 30 years. He got to taste the blood in the water, and I think he liked what it tasted like. And he's going to continue to push until we get the regime change in Iran, because Trump, even though he waffled back and forth, his position ended up at, we're going to make sure Iran can never acquire a nuclear weapon. We blew up their enrichment sites, and the Iranians will never be able to rebuild any enrichment facilities or enrich uranium on our watch ever again. And of course, Steve Witkoff's coming tomorrow for talks. You know, it's always tomorrow. Today it's tomorrow. Tomorrow it's tomorrow. The day after tomorrow it's tomorrow that Steve Witkoff's coming for talks. So we'll see if that eventually happens. I'll be surprised if it does, for a number of reasons. But unless Netanyahu faces a complete domestic collapse in support, I would imagine in some way, shape, or form this war is going to be reignited. Maybe not to the same intensity it was during the 12-day war, maybe not exactly in the same form, but there is going to be some sort of security incident with the Iranians that necessitate further involvement. Or it could be that they do continue to stay off the situation with Iran and continue on with the course in Syria, because it looks like Syria is, surprise, surprise, Jolani's government was not stable. It was not a suitable replacement for the Assad government, whatever faults it might have had, and that Syria is fraying into sectarianism and civil war once again. But maybe that's the real external threat that Netanyahu needs to be there to safeguard the Israeli people against. Maybe he needs to be the lion against Syria now. But so long as he stays in power, they will find some conflicts, legitimate or otherwise, in order to justify the continuation of Netanyahu's emergency powers and to help him evade justice. And even if Netanyahu were to go, there's plenty of people in his cabinet, there's plenty of people in the Israeli government who have much the same idea on what they would do. But in terms of wars that Israel is actually fighting and not doing too well at, you've had a number of security incidences. in the Gaza Strip. The most recent one being on July 7th, where there were 7 Israeli forces killed in action as a result of an ambush by Hamas forces. The first blast struck a tank. They hit rescue teams after that, and then they opened fire on the survivors. It was cut and dry guerrilla warfare against the IDF forces. And you keep seeing this time and time again where there's a number of security instances against the Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip. And despite the immense amount of human damage that's being there just in terms of civilian lives, in terms of any strategic objective, Hamas is still as embedded as ever. To borrow the phrase from somebody I saw discussing the concept the one time, as far as the IDF soldiers are concerned, the rubble speaks Arabic, that they are continuing on this guerrilla campaign even as their homes are pounded into dust, even as the Gaza Strip is turned into dust. The fighters of Hamas are still able to launch these guerrilla hit and run attacks against the Israeli forces and impose a substantial amount of casualties on them. I doubt we'll ever see the real casualty numbers, at least for as long as this war goes on, as long as Netanyahu's in office, and maybe as long as the Israeli state exists, which it's on fragile ground if you ask me, but that's topic for a different time. But it goes back to the principle, to quote Henry Kissinger, love him or hate him, he was correct about this. When it comes to a counterinsurgency, when it comes to a guerrilla war, the side fighting the guerrillas needs to win. The guerrillas simply need not to lose. And that, putting aside any moral precepts, any personal biases, any love or hate for Israel that any individual might have, what we need to look at here is, objectively, the Israelis are a superior military force fighting a counterinsurgency in a land that they are foreign to. And whether or not you think the Israelis have, once again, I'm asking you to put all your personal views aside. Point being is they have not controlled the Gaza Strip for since the modern state of Israel. Now I know there were some periods of occupation, but in any real sense. So they're fighting on their enemy turf. Their enemies have dug in, figuratively and literally, have extensive defense networks, have extensive arms caches, and are able to inflict damages on an army that is, once again, fighting on enemy turf, which will eventually degrade their fighting capacity. And it doesn't seem like there's been enough casualties to the point where, or enough public-facing casualties to the point where the public starts rioting and demanding an end to this war, even though public opinion has gone with the wind, has gone back and forth, whichever way the wind blows. But as it stands right now, even the more extreme elements of this war have a pretty strong backing in the Israeli public. And maybe that's because they don't have to see the nitty gritty of it. Maybe that's because, whatever reason it might be, political, religious, blah, 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 that they are still dedicated to this war. And there might be some who want their cake and eat it too. Want to have their cake and eat it too, where we don't want direct IDF involvement in the Gaza Strip, but we also want complete dominion over it, and we want to control the population flows, blah, 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 over there. But at the end of the day, even after almost 2 years of fighting, we're coming up on the 2-year anniversary just within the next 3 months here. After 2 years of intense fighting in the Gaza Strip, Hamas is still not dislodged, even after a number of targeted strikes on leadership. Hamas is still not dislodged, and that they're still continuing on this fight, and that there's a very real possibility the Israelis reach a breaking point, maybe not in terms of a conventional sense where the IDF just stops functioning, but they reach a breaking point in terms of what they invest in this, where they eventually need to run up the white flag and come to some sort of negotiated settlement. And I know that there's the ever occurring yet never occurring talks between Hamas and American officials, or Hamas and Israeli officials, mediated by Qatar or the United Arab Emirates, or whatever one of the countries, or whatever flavor of the day Gulf Arab state is trying to play the middle road in this conflict. But at the end of the day, you you can look at Israel's strategic situation, and like I said, setting aside all personal biases and morality, the only victory they've scored since October 7th, 2023 is the removal of Assad, which itself has come with a myriad of problems. Some might argue it wasn't even worth it. And I think we can see the direction Israeli society is going in terms of their security concerns when they are issuing 54,000 call-up notices to students at ultra-Orthodox rabbinical schools or religious schools for those trained to be rabbis, Jewish seminaries, as it were, and that they're tightening penalties for draft dodgers. All while you have a number of Israelis fleeing to Cyprus by boat and buying up property, and they are leaving from the port of Haifa and have really poured out of the country in massive numbers. And I mean, I can't imagine a worse position to be in than Cyprus right now. I mean, half your country is occupied by Turkey. It looks like the other half might be occupied by Israel soon, depending on the direction this war goes. Um, Look, I've never been to Cyprus. I've heard great things about it. I've heard it's a wonderful island. I certainly hope to visit uh, while it's still intact, even to some degree. Uh, but they find themselves in an extremely precarious situation where their nation is just a stomping ground for the imperial powers of the world. And that's no position to be in. Like I said, I greatly emphasized with it. I mean, the brutality of the Turkish invasion in 1974 can't be understated either. We've seen what the Turks do in Syria. We've seen what their proxies do in Azerbaijan. It was the same case in northern Cyprus. Um, and now they will have to risk becoming displaced in their own country because a bunch of finance guys from New York who had the right ethno-religious background decided they wanted to live in a kibbutz. When it got too hard, they took their yacht and fled to Cyprus. And that's how this happened. That's how this all happens. And they're going to, if they have their way, I'm being hyperbolic here. I know it's not going to be this skill. If they have their way, they're going to displace another nation of people and say, actually, you were never native to this land. We were promised this land 4,000 years ago, even though none of us believe in any sort of real religious convictions. You see, the Torah and the God that we don't even believe in promised us this land. Therefore, you must see to it. In fact, you Christians over here, if you read your Bible, it says that you have to support our claim, or that it's a religious compulsion that you have to support our claim to this land. Not only do they do that with their own co-ethnic, co-religionists, they try to impose it on everyone else as well. And like I said, when was the last time you think any of these people saw the inside of a synagogue? What, their bar mitzvah? Maybe a wedding? Maybe a funeral? I mean, who are we kidding? Um, when it comes to a lot of these settlers, especially the ones who lived in kibbutzes, it's a very real possibility. What we're looking at is they hadn't set foot in a synagogue since they lived in New York, if we're being honest. And now the fine people of Cyprus, I haven't been to Cyprus, I'll say once again, but having interacted with Cypriots in some limited capacity, once again, I have no ill will against them. I have no reason to dislike them. The fine people of Cyprus have to deal with this coming into what is left of their technically sovereign nation. But moving on to the situation with Iran, the main news for this week is that the IAEA cooperated with Western intelligence, and now Grossi is on his path to promotion, possibly to be Gutierrez's replacement at the UN in the near future. That's one of the speculations going on right now. Not sure whether that was confirmed or denied. You guys can let me know if there's any update on that. But the IAEA cooperated with Western intelligence to help plan these strikes in Iran, and also they gave the flimsy justification for the Americans to continue forward their strikes, And you even have word from the head of French intelligence that he depends on the IEA to locate the enriched uranium. And on top of that, when it comes to the level of spy infiltration, the two most guilty culprits, beyond the IAEA, but when it comes to the Israeli strikes, were Indian nationals who were there for work permits or a number of reasons, and Afghan refugees. And that during Iran's crackdown on spy networks during the 12-day war, they found a significant number of Indians, Hindu Indians, operating alongside domestic collaborators in Iran. That and Afghan refugees who they took in for 20 years, 20 plus years, as their country was torn apart by war and civil war and foreign invasion and takeover by the Taliban. And the way they repay their hosts is they feed information to Israeli assets, which prompted a mass deportation of Afghans, totaling in the hundreds of thousands, tens if not hundreds of thousands, just within a relatively short amount of time, to back to Afghanistan because of their collaborative efforts. Now, admittedly, a lot of these people live in concentrations of refugee camps or refugee areas, so it's not like it was exactly a hard endeavor to find them all. And, well, even though they didn't deport all of them, but to find these groups of them and deport them in mass numbers. And I don't know, I think it's kind of pathetic when, say, the Iranians can do a mass deportation of foreign nationals who have no right to be in the country, but Western governments struggle to put together with much more resources and much more. I don't even want to say competent officials because the West is run by a bunch of clowns as it stands, but with much more resources at its disposal, are unable to conduct the same sort of sweeping illegal immigration raids. Uh, and I don't know, maybe Trump's new ICE budget will be the fix that we need, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. Look, I would love to believe that Trump pumping hundreds of billions of dollars into ICE is going to help them do a clean sweep of the immigration issue, but like I said, I have to wait to see if it actually happens before I can really take any sort of optimism or any sort of joy in that situation. As it stands right now, it's just another empty promise that they'll get to eventually. But to get back to the question of Iran, I did watch the Pezeshkian interview with Tucker Carlson, and I have to say, it was a good interview. It gave some good insight as to what kind of man and what kind of leader Pezeshkian was. In particular, I think he looks very weak. He might be a nice, mild mannered technocrat in terms of a politician you might want during, say, stable economic growth and no social issues and no foreign policy issues. I mean, the man, he has his origin. He was a heart doctor, right? He was some sort of medical professional, I believe he was a heart doctor. Um, I'm not going to speak to the moral character of the man, but he's a weak man when it comes to this position. He's not fit for the kind of leadership for a country that is on the brink of war or even actively at war, depending on um, what phase the conflict might be in, and it could reignite at any moment. He alleged to Tucker that the Israelis tried to assassinate him, along with several other elements of the Iranian civilian leadership. Tucker, for his part, mostly just let him speak. And like I said, I think the interview is worth watching if you have a half hour to spare. It's nothing like great or insightful, but it might have been the translator. But like I said, I feel like he came off as a very weak, reactive man, where he would not take charge of the situation and simply have an on-the-fly reaction to whatever uh, might come his way, as it were. And as far as the Iranians are concerned, I don't think that suggests strong or stable leadership. And I speculated end of last year, beginning of this year, that Pezeshkian, even putting aside the assassination attempts, might not survive politically to the end of the year. And I think there's a very real possibility of that, especially if tensions do reemerge. and that he could be replaced by another hardliner. Now, some might argue, and I've heard this argument go around, that after many of the decapitation strikes by Israel that took out much of the senior brass of the IRGC, the younger, more, let's just say, motivated officers who replaced them were the ones who ordered the retaliation, the ones who really did a great deal of damage to Israel over the course of the 12-day war. And that, in many ways, they are effectively in charge of the country, and that the country is under a quasi-martial law situation where these newly minted IRGC head commanders are calling the shots on these kind of things. I wouldn't go that far, but I think it's a very real possibility now that you do probably have a much younger, more hardline generation in a position of power or in a position of greater power. You are seeing a more concerted Iranian response. And we'll ultimately see, like I said, I think that we're probably looking at a reignition of conflict at some point before the end of the year. Something's going to fall through, like I said, unless there's some sort of not only collapse of Netanyahu's government, but some sort of major system failure in Israel. We're going to see even just a return to a low intensity conflict. Even if it's not directly on Iran soil, it's going to be something that involves them. Because there are enough forces, especially in Tel Aviv, that are dedicated to regime change, and they have strings to pull in Washington. Even if Trump wants to drag his heels, there are ways to make him cooperate either wittingly or unwittingly with it. But since the end of the 12-day war, of course, the Iranians have invested a great deal into restoring their air defenses, in particular with cooperation with China. And this is the HQ-98 system, which they have signed deals for. We're looking at a range about 200 to 250 kilometers, interception altitude about 45 to 50 kilometers, as well as the HQ-22 systems, which are less advanced with only a range of 170 kilometers and interception altitude up to 27 kilometers. But point being is, even though the Iranians, I think, had the upper hand at the end of the 12-day war, they still took a significant amount of loss in manpower and equipment as well, so they do need to replenish, they do need restock. And the fact that China is the one who's going to be heading that up, I don't think is really a surprise, and that it does show the cooperative relationship between Iran and China, and many of the moves between Iran and Russia shows that so long as the Iranians are able to conduct the fight themselves, the Russians and Chinese are not likely to abandon them or just leave them to the wolves, as it were. But on that note, there has been a back and forth story about Putin and his guarantees to the Iranians and the Israelis, respectively. Now, according to Axios, Putin told Israeli officials he supports a complete ban on Iran's nuclear enrichment. However, Iranian officials countered that, saying that they did not receive that message from Putin. Putin has actually been very cooperative when it comes to their uranium enrichment, even beyond just, say, like the minuscule 3% they would need for an energy program, that they are more or less in line with, say, the 60%, which is certainly over the limit needed for an energy program, but also well under the 90-95% you would need to actually weaponize the uranium. But as it stands now, I mean, it could be possible that Putin gave the Israelis some hand-wavy assurance that, oh, yes, we'll make sure the Iranians don't have any enriched uranium, while not relaying that message to the Iranians. Or it could just be that Axios made this up and that they're trying to sow division between the Russians and the Iranians, which I think is much more likely, trying to plant the seeds of distrust between the two. I wouldn't be surprised if they fabricate some statement about China as well, because that is much more likely. Not that I think the Russians necessarily want to see the Iranians have a nuclear weapon, but I think they know the score, they know the stakes, and they know that it's better to have an Iran that either is on the brink of a nuclear weapon, if not outright has one, in a North Korea-style situation, than an Iran that falls victim to yet another regime change and becomes a headache, especially right there on the southern border of Russia, and something that might compromise Chinese access to Iranian oil. The other big news I have out of the Middle East is the dynamic, the back and forth going on between Syria and Israel right now, where Jelani met with Israeli officials in Qatar for the process of normalizing relations. Of course, Jelani has said, "Oh, we'll agree to the Abraham Accords, blah blah blah. We'll negotiate the finer points of that. We can negotiate the status of the Golan Heights." Doing what he does best in selling Syria out completely, while he faces no consequences. But I shouldn't say that he faces no consequences, because the meeting between Jelani and Netanyahu in that was slated in Azerbaijan did not happen, and after that, shortly after that, there was an uptick in violence in Syria regarding clashes between the Syrian National Army and the Syrian Democratic Forces. This took place in uh, Manbij, which was the area that the Turks first seized. The Manbij direction, which is the area the Turks seized in 2018 from the Kurdish forces, for those of you who do remember, as well as clashes in Damascus, fighting along the Euphrates in the Deir Zor region, and of course, this led to Israeli strikes across the country as well, mostly in support of the SDF, and that if Jelani isn't going to give Israel everything it wants, which it looks like he was poised to do for a while, and probably is still poised to do, then war and destruction in Syria will continue, that Israel will participate in it. But as it stands now, with the clashes between the SDF, which, like I said, primarily Kurdish leadership that has ties back to Israel and Washington as well, they would have every interest in reigniting this conflict against Giuliani, who they were probably expecting to be, if not their puppet, an extremely pliable figure. But it looks like he might have to go. Uh, the Israelis are revamping their old ties with the Druze in southern Syria, trying to make a foothold there, possibly using them as a buffer state. We'll see the ultimate result of their their decision when it comes to that, or lack thereof. And it looks like we might be poised for another regime change in Syria for the second one in 7 months. I won't weep to see Jelani go, but I know that nothing better is going to replace him, so I can't really feel one way or another about it, because it's either going to be cleaned up jihadists in suit number one, or cleaned up jihadists in suit number two, or I don't know. Maybe they'll dig up some Kurd and he can be the Syrian Obama who brings unity across the divided ethnic lines, while blah 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 and conceding to Israel's every demand. Maybe that's the move. Maybe that's the case that's going to happen right here. But just a few news items to figure out, or to finish out, I should say. You do have the ongoing tariff dispute. As I said, as it stands now, the U.S. and the European Union are going to implement their tariffs on August 1st if an agreement wasn't reached, because July 9th was the deadline, and then Trump threatened his retaliation. Ursula threatened the retaliation of the European Union. And it's to the usual back and forth. They'll sit down, they'll talk, and they'll continue to kick this can down the road. Lula was very outraged at the idea of 50% tariffs for the BRICS countries, because that was something that Trump had promised over that. He took a very sharp turn against the BRICS countries around the same time. He started to lose patience with Putin, as it were, and had his scolding words for Putin. And Lula was pretty firm against that, which Lula is an odd figure, because he presents himself as this man of the international left, yet is knee deep in U.S. Democratic Party politics. But it also lends itself to, say, a more cooperative spirit with BRICS, so it creates a very strange dynamic. Brazil creates a very strange political dynamic, because even when Bolsonaro was in power, BRICS was a fraction of what it was, but he held his tongue on condemning Russia for the so-called unprovoked invasion, maintained a good relationship with them, Despite his bluster against the Chinese, really stayed business as usual. And as far as India-Brazil relations, I don't think much changed at all in terms of whatever relationship they actually do have. And I expect, once again, these BRICS tariffs to be one of those things where Trump has the magic exemption for, and he's never going to enforce any of these, and this is all going to be more bluster that ultimately leads nowhere, because that is what we can come to expect from the Trump administration. Because, once again, in my opinion, I've stated this before, I've stated it a few times before, Trump feels limited by his second term, by his age, so he's eager to pursue all these large policy agendas instead of just focusing on one or a few in order to cement his legacy, and is ultimately pulling in too many directions, which I think, if anything's going to be his undoing, that will be his undoing. The fact that he's worked himself in such sense of urgency, whether consciously or unconsciously, that he's going to destroy his own legacy. And that's why I think you get the back and forth on Ukraine, the back and forth in the Middle East, the question with the tariffs, the whatever goes on with domestic policy, the deportations or lack thereof, and it's really not a good place for Trump to be in. And whatever faith I had in him to deliver in any sense, I think a lot of that has evaporated. Not that there was that much there in the first place. But he keeps doing this up and down, this roller coaster act, and I know I'm guilty of following every twist and turn with that, but what I have always tried to do, and what I'm going to promise to redouble my efforts on, is that I'm going to try to see a straight line through Trump's ups and downs, or just ups and downs in general when it comes to these very sensationalist news stories, and really try to see a through line through it and make a prediction based on that, and make my analysis based on, well, what's really going on beyond all the song and dance. But with that being said, that's all I had for this week. I hope you guys enjoyed this 2-week recap episode. We'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.